Welcome to this election forum. My name is Jochen Zeil. I'm the current chair of North Canberra Community Council. And this forum has been organized by NCCC, North Canberra Community Council, and regional media. I would like to, the events going to be run by Genevieve Jacobs from regional media. And I would like now just to thank two people who make this possible in the moment. And that is Chris Finnegan, he's the Secretary of NCCC, and Marcus Hipkins, he's the media coordinator. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we live in. And I personally do share their grief, their frustration and their anger about the continuing social injustice they suffer and the continuing seriously degraded national environment which is caused by the way we choose to live. So I would like now to hand over to Genevieve Jacobs to get this forum organized.
Thank you so much, Joachim, and welcome everyone to the North Canberra Community Council Virtual Election Forum, a guaranteed COVID-safe way to find out more about the polls and the promises in your neighbourhood. I'm Genevieve Jacobs. Some of you will remember me from my ABC days. These days, though, I'm the group editor for Region Media, and that's the RiotACT. And we are really delighted to partner with the council to bring you this debate, because for us, it is all about deeply local stories, about this community, about this neighbourhood, about our concerns. We like to say at Region Media that we are local everywhere. And that is, in fact, particularly true for me because I'm from Rounding Wattle Street in Lyneham and I'm currently sitting in Chris's kitchen in Watson. So there's no fancy schmancy studios here. It really is people in the hood. On to the detail as we juggle this new format. We've got several broad themes to explore with our candidates, and they do come out of the work that the North Canberra Community Council has done together. So these ideas have been sourced from the community, from the council's contacts and amalgamated together. They centre around some themes, planning and consultation and compliance. And I think no surprises there in our very fast changing neighbourhood. But make no mistake, we are sitting in a key seat for this election. Kurrajong really matters from wherever you sit, and it's up for grabs in all kinds of ways. So we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so first on planning. That covers specific matters like the ACT planning review, West Basin, but accelerated development, the fact that 37,000 dwellings are planned for this gateway corridor right outside our doorstep. We'll talk about engagement, consultation, how genuine that is when it does or doesn't work. We've noted concerns about climate change and biodiversity, the acceleration of the heat island effect in the inner north, the pressure being placed on local nature reserves, and particularly, of course, during COVID when literally every man and their dog have been out walking in the bush. And we'll also touch on economic matters and social issues. The COVID-19 crisis will have some implications for the ACT's GST revenue. There's the big hit to the uni sector, and of course that's a key economic driver in this part of Canberra, and some specific impacts on North Canberra. We'll leave some time at the end too for questions in other areas than those mentioned, but you can all participate via the live stream, everyone listening the entire way through. And I'll have those questions forwarded to me, but we will just leave that sort of 15 or 20 minute space open at the very end so that if we haven't covered something in our discussions, you've got the chance to raise it. We might not get to all of them. I'm certainly not making any promises. I'm going to ask our candidates to introduce themselves in a moment. They are from ACT Labor, Rachel Stephen-Smith, from the Canberra Liberals, Candice Birch and Elizabeth Lee, from the ACT Greens, Shane Rattenbury and Rebecca Vassarotti, from the Canberra Progressives, Tim Bohm, Peter Swarbrick and Therese Faulkner, and Bruce Paine from the Independents. So Rachel Stephen-Smith, I might start with you. Tell us who you are.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. I'll just check that you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Beautiful. Well, I'm Rachel Stephen-Smith. I am one of the local members for Kurrajong. I was elected in 2016. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and acknowledge Genevieve as well as one of the co-chairs of the ACT Reconciliation Council that's been doing such great work in bringing people together towards reconciliation and healing, a journey that we have some way to go on yet. I also want to thank Joachim and the NCCC for hosting this forum and for the work that you do throughout the year, looking at development proposals in particular, but a range of issues right across the inner north. I, of course, grew up in the inner north. I grew up in O'Connor. I was born in Canberra. I went to fantastic local public schools, O'Connor Co-op, Turner Primary, Lynham High and Dixon College. And I've really enjoyed the 4 years representing this fabulous part of Canberra, as well as, of course, the beautiful areas in the inner south. So I think I've probably taken up more than my a lot of time already just introducing myself. But I'm looking forward to the questions today. I'm hoping that I can continue to be a genuine, strong and progressive voice for the inner north and really reflect the values of our community in the Legislative Assembly.
Thank you, Rachel. And yes, a reminder, of course, that this being Zoom, one of the advantages is I could just mute the lot of you. So careful on the timing. Candice, let's hear from you.
I'm Candice Birch. I am one of your Canberra Liberal representatives for the electorate of Kurrajong. I'm the Shadow Minister for Transport and Public Sector Management. I have lived in Kurrajong for 13 years now, in both the north and the south. I'm currently in Kingston, but I spent quite a few years in Braddon and Downham before that. It has been a great honour and privilege to represent you for the past 2.5 years. I was elected on countback at the end of 2017 after my predecessor, Steve Dospot, unfortunately passed away. So it has been a great privilege to represent you over the last few years. The Canberra Liberals, of course, this election are fighting for lower rates, lower taxes and better services across Canberra.
Bruce Paine, to you.
Yeah, thank you, Genevieve, and everyone else involved in organising this. I've lived in Kurrajong for very nearly 50 years, and I attended Campbell High School, as did my son, actually. Look, I think there's shortcomings in all of the 4 areas that you're anticipating or intending to discuss, and I think we can do much better across them. I'll just pick on one of them mention one thing in my opening statement. I think many people would be surprised to know that the ACT government already spends the equivalent of $15,000 per person per year for every person in Canberra. And despite that, Labor and Greens have said they're going to increase our rates by 3.5% a year after a pause. One important thing I want to bring on is a proper review of where that money is being spent. As various people have noted, including John Stanhope, it's extremely hard to reconcile where that money's going. Look, I'm basically standing as an independent, and I think there's some very good reasons to vote independent, including that the ACT is actually the only state and territory that doesn't have a single independent in its state equivalent legislature. And I think there's a much better way forward than what we've had. So thank you. I look forward to answering any questions.
Peter, to you. Oh, I think we've got you muted, Peter. Just let me see if I can unmute you. Oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Sorry, just a bit of domestic clatter in the background that I didn't think you guys needed to hear. Well, I'm actually here with Therese Faulkner and Tim Bohm. I'm not going to talk for too long because Therese is our official representative, and sorry we couldn't all be in the same room. I'm actually standing in the seat of Kurrajong. I've lived here in Canberra for 20 years, so I'm on the south side in Narrabundah. Really, in a nutshell, I think, similarly to Bruce, that we do need some cross-bench activity in the Legislative Assembly. That's what the Canberra Progressives are hoping to achieve. I'm, very proud to be in this election this year. Fantastic to be standing with some really brilliant women. I love to see as many women in politics as possible. So I'm going to hand it back to you because I think Therese will actually sort of introduce our broader platform.
Okay, let me go to Rebecca first. Rebecca.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful place that we get to call home and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, recognising that this was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Rebecca. I'm actually a born and bred Canberran. I've lived in Kurrajong for the last 20 years. Me and my family, including school-age kids, have called Kurrajong home for around 20 years. I'm really passionate about Canberra. I think it's an amazing place to live and we're very privileged to live here. Certainly, most of my professional life, I have spent a lot of time making sure that and working for Canberra to work for everyone, particularly those that are struggling, and so have been deeply connected with many community organisations in areas including housing and homelessness, community services, poverty and disadvantage. So really come with a real passion for social justice, and really proud to be a member of the ACT Greens candidate team that's running this election. I think that there's a real opportunity for us to really use this moment to create a better normal, to not go back to where we were before, where there was significant inequality. And so really I'm keen to be sharing a bit more of that as we move through the evening.
Elizabeth. Can't hear you.
There we go. Now you've let me do it. I knew that you would hit that button for power. Thank you, Genevieve. Good evening, everybody. My name's Elizabeth Lee, and along with Candice Birch, I'm one of your Canberra Liberal candidates standing again, but also a member for Kurrajong. Like most candidates who have said, I've lived most of my Canberra life here in Kurrajong, mostly in Braddon, although I recently moved the switched over to the dark side, over to the south. But I did mostly live in Braddon. Thank you to the NCCC for hosting this forum tonight, and I'm really looking forward to some of the discussions that we're going to have. I've held the roles in terms of portfolio areas in education, disability and the environment, and it's been a real privilege to be able to be the voice for Kurrajong over the last 4 years.
Okay, Therese.
Oh, thanks, Genevieve. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm Therese Faulkner, candidate for the Canberra Progressives seat of Kurrajong. A bit like everyone else, I grew up in Canberra. I've been a resident of Kurrajong for the past 13 years, mainly in Lyneham and O'Connor, where I live now, and for a while in Kingston. But interestingly, I spent a lot of time in the Kurrajong Valley as a person who raised their kids there in some much more affordable housing in Kurrajong Valley than in the seat of Kurrajong. And also I grew up in Belconnen, going to Higgins Primary School and High School. So a bit of perspective from a few different parts of the city. Look, the Canberra Progressives, we offer a viable alternative to the major parties, and we're running on a platform of three principles. I guess the word progressives means we want to see progress underpinned by a set of really solid principles going forward. The three principles we're operating under are ethics, evidence, and empowerment. And just briefly, ethics is about, not giving into vested interest, that we make decisions on in the best interest of the community and not through any sponsors or donors, etc., etc. Evidence, we're not driven by an ideology. We actually will take the evidence and base our decision making on that. And empowerment, we'd like to see genuine community engagement and put planning of the city in the hands of the citizens through some really proactive measures around community engagement. So that's empowerment.
Okay, Shane.
Thanks, Genevieve, and thanks to NCCC for hosting us this evening. I've been really proud to represent this electorate for a number of terms now, and on behalf of the Greens, implement a range of policies that have made Canberra more sustainable, more progressive, and have been very practically moving this city forward. Through the course of this year, I think we've been given a real moment of reflection. Between the bushfires, the smoke, and now the pandemic, it's shown us that we have lots of vulnerabilities that we need to tackle. And as the Greens going forward, we want to really look at issues like the housing affordability crisis in Canberra, build more social and affordable housing, to continue to tackle climate change, and to work on those governance issues that really do matter to people around bringing people into politics more. I think that there is cynicism about politics, and one way we think we can really address that is to have people more involved in decision making through processes like deliberative democracy. And we'll be pleased to talk more about particularly our planning policy and some of those ideas for deliberative democracy as the night goes on.
Okay, and last but never least, the man who just loves nominating for politics, Tim Bohm. Go for it, Tim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, the NCCC, and definitely Region Media. Thank you, Genevieve, for giving up your time. Just quickly, I thank everyone for coming as well. And what Therese said was spot on with what we're all about, the Canberra Progressives. I live in Watson, have done for 12 years. I've got kids that go to the Majura Primary School, got kids that go to school in Dixon, and I've got kids that play sport in Dixon as well. So heavily invested in the inner north. And the feedback I'm getting is that the inner north is just being ignored or taken for granted. So that's one of my big drivers at this election, is to stand up for the local community. That's it.
Okay, let's get cracking on this. Let's start with the questions, and a reminder to those who are listening that if you want to send your questions in via the Zoom, we can get them up onto technology here. No promises that we'll get to everyone's question, but we'll do our best. Candice, I want to start with you. We're looking at planning first, and there is, of course, an ACT planning review underway. Planning is a key question for this demographic at all times. We're seeing incredibly rapid growth and development with those 37,000 new dwellings coming in. What do we need to look at most urgently with regard to how planning functions with regard to North Canberra?
Look, I think planning is something that frustrates a lot of Canberrans at the moment, but particularly in the inner north. Our planning system is broken from top to bottom, and one of the really key issues there is that it is no longer community-centric. A lot of Canberrans feel that it has become way too developer-centric, and I know there is a lot of frustration in the community that people in the community themselves have to spend so much time wading through paperwork and through DAs to put together objections to things because the planning system is not working as it should. So we definitely need to make sure that we are consulting, and we are consulting properly. We are actually consulting genuinely and taking on board community feedback and making sure that it is actually, our planning system is actually community centric. We also need to, another big issue I think a lot of people feel with the frustrations with the government at the moment is that there is often a short-term view when it comes to planning, and as a result the government isn't providing the necessary infrastructure around planning decisions. So particularly in suburbs like Watson and Downer, where they've had a huge explosion in population growth in recent years, and things like the shops, parking at the shops, local schools, local community facilities have not been upgraded. More broadly across Canberra, we've seen similar things where public transport has been completely neglected, and we've had entirely new suburbs, and it's taken years for the government to catch up and actually provide public transport in those regions. So I think infrastructure planning is a key part that needs to come and be provided alongside those planning decisions, and not something that is neglected for years and we spend years trying to catch up again.
Okay, Rachel, I'll go to you. Can you defend the planning process? Is it possible to satisfy everyone? And if not, who actually ends up making those choices?
Thanks, Genevieve. I think you've hit the nail on the head in some respects. It's not, there is nowhere in the world that has a planning system that genuinely satisfies everyone. But where I think, and you've noted that the ACT government is undertaking a planning review, and obviously that process, and I'm not going to blame COVID for everything, but that process has been delayed as a result of COVID in terms of that next stage of community engagement. But it is and remains a really important piece of work, because for multiple reasons, but I think part of the challenge that we face in the planning system is that it isn't transparent enough, and it's not very easy for people to engage. So those who know what they're doing do engage very deeply and closely, and that does require a lot of time and effort. And one of the things that I find very frustrating through the planning system, and I've said this in forums before, is that it is the rules-based system that we have enables people to tick boxes and still deliver an outcome that doesn't meet the needs of the community and doesn't reflect the neighbourhood in which the development is happening. And so one of the key focus areas of the planning review is how do we change to an outcomes-focused planning system that people can genuinely understand better. And I think a good example of this is a lot of work a few years ago happening on master plans, and I'm going to preempt Candace throwing my comment at a previous community meeting back at me. But a lot of really intensive work done by communities with consultants to develop really comprehensive master plans for their areas, but without a really clear understanding of the fact that the planning people saw that as a long-term plan that had to be delivered over multiple years in collaboration between government and the private sector and developers. And people put a lot of work and effort into those master plans and then expected that government would be able to deliver it all straight away. And so there was a real disconnect between the community's expectations and what government was actually trying to achieve. And so getting that real transparency about what it is we're asking people, what we're asking for their input on, what we're going to be able to deliver, and the timeframes over which we are looking to plan, and then how things will change as situations evolve. All of that, I think, is critical, and then doing it on a area by area basis, so that because we understand that needs in Tuggeranong are different to the needs in the inner south, are different to the needs in the inner north, are very different to the needs in a newer community like Gungahlin.
Therese, I want to go to you on this, on the Progressive Party, because it seems to me what Rachel's been saying is a lot about communication as much as anything. Where does the Progressive Party sit on planning priorities? We all know how anxious many locals can be about the speed of what's happening here, and sometimes it seems like it's warp speed in the inner north in particular.
Yeah, that's right. Look, the Progressives, I guess we're taking a holistic view of planning, and I think all of those topics that you mentioned at the beginning are integrated. Planning, community engagement, climate change, sustainability, and the economic issues all play into that same space. The Progressives have got quite a number of policies around this, noting that if we win seats, we won't form government, but we will hopefully be able to inform government priorities. We think that there's a perception in the community, or we've heard that there's a perception in the community that the community's not being listened to, that there's, I guess, some token consultation, but not that genuine community engagement on those planning issues. I'll pass to Peter, I think, to make some further comments from the Progressives.
Okay, Peter, quickly, if you would.
Sure, thanks, Therese. Look, I think some of the things that we're also hearing about is a kind of, raising minimum standards in terms of the development part of the planning process. A lot of people get confused about these sort of unsolicited proposals, and I have a lot of conversations with community members who feel that they're constantly cast as NIMBYs about particular developments, that they're always having to fight rather than having been part of this deliberative process. At the beginning, they're actually having to always be in opposition. So that seems to be a real disconnect. And from what Rachel Stephen-Smith was saying, in these fantastic community plans, communication clearly is the key, because the expectation was there that it was to be delivered, whereas the government had a different expectation. So there's these broader aspects of how you communicate. What is consultation? What is engagement? And I think that is going to clear up a lot of things, because if people don't feel that trust, that they're not listened to, they're not going to be as open to understanding about how complex these things are, how long they take, and that there is a process in place. They're going to feel that there's things at play they're not being told about.
Shane, you have held the balance of power. You have delivered government to the Labor Party. What's your position on the priorities here? I mean, is it, for example, zoning? What are the principles that need to guide the planning process, but particularly this review that's underway at the moment, to deliver some sense of certainty and some sense of a clear understanding from the community as a whole about these planning issues?
Look, Genevieve, we have frustrations with the planning system as well, and I think we're not getting the outcomes that Canberra really needs. Our planning policy is coming out tomorrow morning, but I'm happy to sneak preview it tonight. It'll really, focus on making sure that Canberra's buildings are climate ready, that we get better design standards so that as Canberra gets hotter and drier, our buildings are better designed for it. We want to bring back government certification of multi-unit buildings because we are seeing real issues with building quality, and we think having private certifiers is a shortcoming. We want to change the land sale rules so that when a block gets sold, it actually goes to the best quality project, not just the highest bidder. And obviously we've got a real focus on ensuring tree protection in the city. I mean, it's all well and good. We want to plant more trees in the city, but we actually need to make sure that we're not losing the mature trees that are there at the moment. Those are incredibly valuable, and we're very deeply frustrated by the approach at the moment, which is when you go to redevelop something, we see the block being scraped clean and people starting again. And one of the best things we can do to protect our tree canopy in the city is to make sure we don't lose those mature trees in the first place.
And look, I do want to talk more about the trees a little later on because we'll go to some of those environmental issues and the issues around heat islands. But Rachel, it just occurs to me that maybe one of the things that is of value here is the design review panel, and whether that's something that could be expanded to cover all major developments, whether they were inside the National Capital Corridor or not. I mean, is something like that a break on the sense that things happen in a kind of a piecemeal and ad hoc way? That's the perception of some in the community, at least.
Yeah, absolutely, Genevieve. The design review, the National Capital Design Review Panel has been a really important innovation, and indeed does cover developments outside of the Northbourne Avenue corridor and those national capital areas of interest. And yeah, people have said to me, could it be used for lower scale buildings? You know, the 3-story townhouse, for example, you know, the 2-story townhouse. It's the amount of work that they would have to do that is probably not feasible for that type of process. But it is a really important innovation to deliver better quality. And I think what we are going to see over the next couple of years is the way developers actually respond to that. And so I have a bit of a mantra, having done a master's degree in planning and real estate development with a focus on affordable housing. I have a real mantra about developers being good neighbours, whether they're government, whether they're private, or whether they're not for profit. It's actually is up to them to engage with their local community early, to actually talk people through what they're intending to do and to take on board that feedback genuinely. And they need to do the same thing with the National Capital Design Review Panel. But the panel provides the people who will be commenting through pre-DA and through development application with something concrete that they can point to and say, hang on, they told you this and you still haven't done it. Why haven't you done it? That's an advantage. But the other element of the planning review is then about how do we put that quality and that character right through those lower scale developments as well. And the panel isn't probably the most practical way to do it, but that's one of the key things we've heard back through the planning review.
Okay, so that certainly indicates that there is a need and an appetite for some sense of review and some sense of transparency over how things will actually look. There's more to this though than just the way things look. I want to talk about a couple of other factors before we move on. Elizabeth, this week's announcements from the Liberals have been about transport, although today that's largely been about things like light rail and bus networks. What about a traffic study? What about an analysis of just how we're going to manage those 37,000 people, the people who will inhabit all those apartments and must surely cause considerable congestion in this area?
Oh, look, there's no doubt about that, Genevieve. And as Candice mentioned earlier, it is about the current plan not taking into consideration the broader infrastructure issues and thinking broadly into the long term. And that is something that has clearly been neglected under this Labor government. And we need to make sure that not only do we have a system that is community centric, but it is thinking about the long-term impacts as well. And that includes key infrastructure issues like our roads, like our paths, like our schools, like our local shops. Okay. I don't know if Candice wants, or she's transport, but.
No, I don't have much more to add. It just comes back to making sure that that long-term planning is happening.
and is part of the infrastructure planning is part of the entire integrated planning process.
Can I just add as well, Genevieve, that in terms of when it does come to planning, we've talked about and touched on the fact that there has been a lack of transparency, which does provide uncertainty to every stakeholder, all the way from government, as Shane's mentioned that sometimes he gets frustrated by it too, and he's sitting around the cabinet table, and all the way through to our the local residents who are nearby, to the components themselves as well. We need to make sure that that is actually brought into the system, that certainty, so that when there is a breach, there is accountability, clear accountability, and that there is clear enforcement for those breaches.
And look, Andrea's pointing out via the message stream, it's not 37,000 residents, it's 37,000 apartments with, say, 100,000 people in them, and the significant number of cars that goes along with that. And that's the average car ownership in Canberra is a person per car, whether it works out that way or not. But that does lead me to, Rebecca, something that I wanted to put to you, and that's about public transport. Clearly, that's part of the answer here. But even so, you'd have to concede that it's not going to fit that volume of people, will it? I mean, the allegation against the Greens is that your policies are driven by a need to get rid of cars. How do you respond to the question about how the volume of people here is going to be managed?
Look, there's no doubt that this is going to, create, a very different, a very different mix of what's happening in this place. And I think for us, it's really about looking at, how we do evolve as a more compact city. With climate change, that is something that we need to do, and we do need to be living differently. We do need to be living differently, and transport is part of that. There's a really significant challenge that we have in terms of transport. Absolutely, public transport is part of the is part of the answer. Private vehicles is part of the answer, but also active travel is also part of the answer as well. So it's really looking at all of these different elements. But we do, it is something that we need to look in a very holistic manner and make sure that we're sort of looking at it from all angles. We need to create a city where it doesn't fit. Most people in this city feels that you cannot live in this city without a car. We actually do need to get to a point where you can move around easily in the city without the need for private transport. We need to be able to, have cycling infrastructure that actually means that we can move across our suburbs. So, the active transport element is a really important element. We need to ensure that even with our private transport, that we are actually building infrastructure so we can move to low and no emissions vehicles as well. So there's no doubt that it's complex, but it's around having a plan to work that through. And we need to have more answers than the fact that every household, feels that they need to have a vehicle to get around this city.
And look, Anthony's commented, I'd like to have more choice in transport, public transport, bike paths, move to electric car and bus fleet. I think we could get plenty of discussion out of this, but I just wanted to touch on, given, Tim, to you, the West Basin announcement, which has been very controversial. A lot of the questions that have been asked on development along the Northbourne Spine have also been development driven. Do you have a view about the influence of developers on the kinds of planning issues that we've been talking about here, the volume of traffic, things like design review, the role that's played in the community for any consultation? What are your thoughts about developers and the influence they may have?
Developers in the ACT, they've got a bad rap, don't
They
they?
do, hence the question.
Well, the Canberra Progressives want to see, proper community consultation. So with the West Basin development, we'd want to see a proper community consultation happen down there, before we let developers go nuts with plans and things like that first. So yeah, so developers, I think they have too much influence. There's too much connection. There's not enough transparency between the major parties and developers. We need to make sure. So there's 3 or 4 sort of cases that should be in front of the ACT ICAC, but it was delayed for 4 years. So there's no wonder there's zero sort of confidence in developers in this town.
Bruce, I just want to go to you quickly on what role an independent would play in that conversation, because clearly the way Hare Clark works and the kinds of very narrowly balanced governments that we've had in the ACT for a long time, there's the possibility for an independent to really go in boots and all. Where would you stand on the issue of what the planning priorities are?
Look, you use the term boots and all. If I'm elected, I'll be seeking to treat everyone equally. And, you know, people mention developers get a bad rap. Look, it's not surprising they use their influence and anyone else tries to use their influence. I think the problem's really about that they've managed to, I'd say, unduly influence Labor. And the Greens have other agendas and therefore they're not willing to call Labor out. Now, you asked for me about planning, very much about, I think, the hierarchy's proper consultation, then the publication of proper master plans, and then having strict binding limits on key criteria. I agree with a lot of the poor outcomes that have been identified. I mean, personally, I contribute, you know, a significant amount of money to trying to oppose one development. I was only one of several, and that excluded all the unpaid time that various people put in. I mean, it's ridiculous when a DA for, you know, a two-storey building literally runs to hundreds of pages. And I know that the NCCC and other community councils, they basically spend, you know, a high proportion of their time doing work that the government should tell public servants to do. But, you know, my judgment is, from, you know, watching what's gone on in this town, is that Labor's too close to the developers. The Greens won't stand up to the community. Public servants know which side their bread's buttered on, so they wave stuff through. Now, on West Basin, I've come out very clearly and said I oppose any residential or commercial development there. I mean, I think it's ridiculous to fill in about a third of that basin. If you go down there now, as in the last few days, the barricades are up, you know, the quarrying's about to start. It really, to me, seems like it's the height of sort of arrogance to move forward at this stage.
Yeah, an interesting comment too on the stream. Developers need to have a curatorial responsibility to create good places to live with green space, community facilities, safe construction, affordability and quality facilities. That's Craig from ACCOS on the stream. And I think certainly everyone who's been engaged in this for a long time knows that there are people in the development community who do that and people in the development community who don't do that. So there's certainly willingness, and it's really possible to have development that's informed by green space, livability and creating real strength of community. Just on the transport question, I've got a text from someone who says, as someone who regularly commuted to work via light rail pre-COVID, I can attest that it is jammed full at peak hour from Dixon onwards, and even with extra services could not cope with the expected additional numbers on Northbourne. It's not clear that we have the public transport solution that will cater for this quickly growing population. Look, questions coming in thick and fast now from the audience and navigating through all of those. But I do want to move on to our second section on engagement, and that goes to consultation. Again, a great and enduring Canberra question on the nature of consultation, how effective it is and how it is actually applied. Candace, I might return to you and Elizabeth first. Section 72 here in Dixon, that also probably encompasses the common ground issue. The North Canberra Council is suggesting that Section 72 could have been an outstanding precinct, but they say a couple of years on, the design scenarios that have been presented for this really key hub, I'm gesturing behind me because that's where it is. Everyone local will get a sense of my orientation. But the design scenarios don't present something that's a community hub. The residential plans, however, are critical for the government's financial model for financing light rail. So there is this real twist and pull balance going on here with residential development, with financing, with identifying the needs for a suburb. Would you have changed that model?
I think, again, consultation is really key, and the community really does feel with all of these developments that consultation has been disingenuous, and the government often just treats it as a box ticking exercise. And as a lot of candidates have already mentioned, it is about, you know, residents spend so much time and so much money, as Bruce mentioned as well, going through objections and going through that process when it should be the bureaucrats doing that job in the first place.
Okay, Rachel, let me go to you on that, because the council's arguing strongly that a community and cultural hub at Section 72 is exactly what's needed for community building for this community. And that's just good urban planning, about how people live in these places rather than just sleep there. And I think everyone would agree that the last thing you want to do with all the development around us here in the inner north is to create a place that people leave in the morning, come back to late at night and have no engagement and involvement with. How is residential development a better solution than the kind of community hub we're just suggesting there?
Well, I don't think it is, Genevieve, and I think that's a bit of a misrepresentation of the consultation we have had with the community about Section 72. Now, I recognise absolutely the frustration of the community at this on-again, off-again consultation, and obviously I've only been involved in the most recent round of this, and I know that there was rounds before that, but we, you know, following our conversations with the North Canberra Community Council, with Dixon Residents and Downer Community Association, commissioned a community needs analysis, which is public, in relation to what is required in the area and what could potentially go in on Section 72. We then hit another speed bump. So our last round of consultation on Section 72 was really predicated on the Salvation Army had indicated that they were going to relinquish Block 22, which for those familiar is the one that runs right through the middle of what was the empty 3 blocks in Section 72 and ties together that piece between Horden Place and Rosevear. Unfortunately, we got to a point where we were just about to start a community reference group to bring together that community needs analysis to talk about what that was going to look like right across the facility with common ground, but also what else can we put on this site. And the Salvation Army indicated that they had changed their position. They'd done a review of their land holdings in the ACT and they were not going to relinquish that block. So that process was then put on hold. And then, of course, again, you know, COVID and other issues. But we actually agree, and the community needs assessment really demonstrated some of the needs in the community. And so we hold Block 6 there. I think your opening comment is right. It does have the potential. Section 72, right from the pool through to Horden Place, has the potential to be a fantastic precinct. My view is that Common Ground is going to contribute to that. It's not about housing people with disability. The targets are in relation to women who are at risk of or are homeless, including women with children, for those 20 of the 40 units and then 40 affordable housing. And the design of that, and I know people will disagree, but the design has been done to take into account the community feedback that we have received. And I also just want to note, Genevieve, that I know people on this forum will have really, really strong views about Section 72, but they weren't the only views that we heard. And when we distributed the outcomes of that community consultation, we distributed warts and all. We put out every single comment that we'd had from the community. And if people read through that, they will see that the community in the inner north area has a wide range of views about appropriate use for that site, and many people do support an element of residential on that site alongside community and cultural facilities.
And look, I am getting lots of comments in. Sorry, Tim. I'll come to you in just a moment. I'm certainly getting a lot of comments in on Section 72, and I know this is a hot button issue. Shane Rattenbury, I just want to go to you for a moment on common ground, because this is certainly one of the things that's really fired up people in many different ways in this community. The community says, no, I'm not going to say the community says, a number of people in the community say that the common ground site is just wrong. People who have been involved in common ground say that there's just NIMBYism going on. Now, this is one of those real tensions on both sides where people passionately believe that both of them are right, and there are some pretty nasty allegations slung back either way as to why people would accuse others of NIMBYism, why they would plant common ground where it's been planted. I mean, what grounds does community consultation have from your perspective as somebody who plays that role within granting power to the government on consultation? I mean, does the government listen to this kind of consultation? Does it have to implement it?
Well, I think we could have made a lot of progress on Section 72 by using more of this deliberative style of democracy. It's been touched on in the conversation. There are some really diverse views of what Section 72 should be. There's lots of people who support common ground. I've heard someone in the last few weeks saying we should use the site to build a new school. Others have said it should be an arts and cultural precinct. There's lots of great ideas, and it's clearly a place the community has passion about. I think the use of the call-in power to get common ground through is a real travesty, in the sense that what it does do is it undermines people's trust in that project. We support common ground. We think it's really important that we invest in this sort of housing for people who desperately need it in this city. But I think doing things like using the call-in it really does breach that sense of community buy-in to what the outcome is.
Okay, Tim Bohm, you wanted to say something about the use of the call-in powers, another very familiar feature of these development arguments in Canberra.
Yeah, I was just going to, but Shane just touched on it there about, I was going to ask Rachel, you know, if it was so popular and everyone loved the idea of common grounds, why do we have to use the call-in powers? And imagine, I put a question to you, Rachel, if we didn't have call-in powers, would we have to actually do consultation and actually work it out?
Okay, Rachel, I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
Look, I think Mick Gentleman has said that in his entire time as planning minister, which he has been for a long time, he's used the call-in powers on average once, and there are thousands of development applications processed every single year. This was about, we'd already had 3 years of consultation in relation to common ground, what it was going to look like, where it was going to be, and how it's going to fit into Section 72. And we knew that there were a wide range of views across the community. In the call-in, Minister Gentleman also included a range of requirements, including around archaeological examination of the site, including around tree protection, reflecting the feedback of the community through that process. But at some point, we do have to get on with these things that are for the public good. I know there's another question on here around homelessness, and people constantly ask me what we are doing about homelessness. This Housing First project is absolutely key to getting 20 families who would otherwise be homeless into a permanent home so that they can get the wraparound supports they need to get on with their lives and move potentially into the private rental market once they've got their lives back together, and bring more people in. So, you know, it is a balancing act, but these call-in powers are not used very often, and they're only used after there actually has been a significant amount of community engagement and for the common good.
Okay. Numbers of comments coming in, one saying common ground can go anywhere. We don't have to lose community resources for the benefit of everyone else, including the clients. Interesting one from Ian, who says, would politicians support a moratorium on residential development on community facilities land while a review is undertaken on the need and value to the local community? And his point is not so much connected with common ground and the particularities of this project, I guess, but the point that community facilities, he says, seem to be disappearing in a time when the community is feeling more isolated. Bruce, I can see you nodding. Go for that.
Look, I've written letters, and I'm on the public record basically saying that we really need to preserve the existing open ground. And, you know, I'm not talking about common ground, existing open spaces. So all this nibbling away around the edge of the ovals, blah, 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 you know, it's just inconsistent and rings very hollow for the Greens to talk about worrying about climate change, and yet they sit there and let Labor basically carve off open space, frankly, to sell it, to pay for light rail is what it comes down to. So look, I basically, you know, veto filling in any more open ground.
Okay, I just want to acknowledge Magnus, who is 9, who has just joined us. And Magnus says, I would like to introduce a few problems. And one is, can the lights on Northbourne and Wakefield be changed to allow a better traffic flow during peak hour, which is probably slightly out of our flow. But Magnus, I'll put that question to the panel, and actually to the Liberals transport spokesman. Candice, would you like to take on the issues around the traffic lights on Northbourne and Wakefield?
Mute me, yes. Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay. So this is actually something that we did announce in part of our transport policy on Monday, is to properly look into those kinds of technologies and make sure that we are utilising the best technology in Canberra to speed up traffic flows and to reduce congestion. So that is absolutely something that we do want to look into.
Okay.
And hello, Magnus. Thanks for joining us.
Yes. And Rachel Stephen-Smith, Magnus has a second question, which is, what are you going to do to the playgrounds in Dixon? Magnus says our play equipment isn't modern or fun compared to the modern facilities elsewhere.
Magnus, I can say that we have certainly heard the feedback from Inner North residents about the need to improve and enlarge playgrounds, including with adventure play. And I think my colleague Chris Steele will have a bit more to say about that in due course.
Okay, let's just return to the consultation questions we were delving into. Nicholas says, people complaining about the use of call-in powers should put themselves in the position of the clients of Common Ground. If you were a single mother homeless with your children, would you support the use of call-in powers? Rebecca, I just wanted to move away, if I could, from Common Ground and Section 72 for a moment and go to another contentious site, and that's the Cyro site up on Limestone Avenue. Now, the North Canberra Community Council made a number of suggestions there that have not been implemented. We've now got, of course, a major challenge going on heritage and environmental grounds, and that's on the area that's controlled by the NCA, but there's adjoining land that's ACT government as well. That puts a very major development at risk. DOMA have gone a long, long way. What could have gone better in the consultation and planning process?
Look, I think this is a really good example of some real challenges with the planning system. It's absolutely further complicated by the fact that we have had the NCA, a Commonwealth Government department involved, as well as ACT government agencies involved. So it is complex, but there has certainly been some significant failures, and we have been really were quite disappointed to see that some of the key obligations that should have happened many years ago, such as the Indigenous Heritage Assessment, that was in fact told by ACT government that it should happen, did not happen, and actually only happened, once the community got involved and agitated, and certainly the ACT Greens were able to lend support and amplify some of those concerns. So thankfully, that is finally happening. But it does create this real issue, is that having visited the site myself, there is very, it is likely that there is significant Indigenous cultural heritage that is in this site, and we need to respond to this. We're also really concerned, have been really concerned about adjacent land to this site that is controlled by ACT government and does have endangered species on it, and there hasn't really been adequate protections in relation to people joyriding and really degrading that site as well. So it really does really brings together a few significant challenges with the planning system. It's been sort of interesting when we talk about community consultation. Certainly the ACT Greens view is that we need to really look at, beyond community consultation, how do we do community engagement, involvement in planning better? And we know what some of the answers are. There has been the Standing Committee on Planning's recommendations that have come out that have given really good 66 recommendations about how to support the community involvement in a much more meaningful way. And that's, one way that we could start by implementing the 66 recommendations, and that's certainly one of the things that the ACT Greens would support, will support.
A note on the screen from Chris just with reference to the playgrounds. Demolishing the ABC flats got rid of 5 playgrounds. That's a whole other can of worms, though. Therese, I just wanted to go to you on your judgment from the Progressives' perspective on the actual value of community consultation. Now, the government strongly defends the consultation process. I have heard through my many long years in the Canberra media, many times people say, well, I feel like things are just moved around on the chessboard. What's your judgment of whether there's value in the process and it actually flows through to outcomes?
Yeah, look, I think there could be more value gained from the process. We're never going to get community consensus. I think that is probably unattainable, but genuine community consultation could look a lot better than it does now. So what the Canberra Progressives are proposing is that we take issues to the community rather than sitting back and waiting for the community to stumble across issues. And we could be using technology a lot more as well through quick sort of nano surveys, mobile phone technology, email, etc. So have a more holistic process of consultation. and I guess full transparency on the process and then on the outcomes as well.
Okay, and the transparency question, just referring back to our conversation about developers and their role, is one that clearly often troubles people. Elizabeth, I just wanted to go to you. We discussed a moment ago the Syro site up on Limestone and the issues that have gone on there. As I mentioned, there's a major development that's now paused, and there's economic activity that is implicit in that as well. So if this is a failure, it's a failure all round on many fronts. What's your view on the community's role in that and how that could have been progressed better?
The fact is, and I think everyone is on the same page and in furious agreement about some of the issues in our planning system. And it is about making sure that the base and foundation of our planning system is built on transparency, which of course in turn builds trust within the community, so that they don't feel when they're being consulted, they come into it suspicious that there's something there and they have to comb through everything because there's going to be an issue that is going to be hoodwinking them. And I think that that is really, really important. If the community does not have trust in our planning process, then they are going to, and as you referred to, I think in the very opening comments, Genevieve, or maybe it was Bruce, I can't remember, but feel that they have to fight every single thing. And that really starts off on the back foot. And as we know with any relationship, when that trust is not there, it's really, really hard to build that back up. So it is about making sure that that community trust is actually there.
Okay, I've got some interesting comments on this. One saying, when residential developments are proposed on community land, why isn't there an alternative that would be based on residential land? There are 5 blocks for sale on Cowper Street, Dixon, from Willing Sellers, and they're zoned RZ3. Is it because community land has little value and is seen as cheaper? Shane, I'm going to throw that to you.
Sure, Genevieve. Well, certainly the community land is generally used for government projects. That other land will be on sale on the private market. And so that's probably the key differentiation there. I think there is a really important discussion to be had about community facilities land, particularly in the inner north, where we are seeing real densification and we are losing some of those facilities, and we're going to need them. As the population grows, we need to make sure where more people are living in apartments, we've got good quality open space, because that is now effectively a person's backyard if you live in an apartment, that we've got things like community halls where people can have meetings. It's one of the reasons as part of our plan for the future of Canberra's clubs that we want to make sure that there's pokey-free venues across the city so people can go and hire a room without having to walk into a venue full of poker machines. They're the sort of things that we need to work on if we are going to ensure we've got good community facilities as the population grows in this part of town.
Well, actually on that, Jane's texted to say, please push the candidates to commit to reviewing and upgrading playgrounds and informal nature play space in the inner north urgently. In line with the release of land for infill and ongoing DAs for multi-unit housing. Most children and young people have little in the way of resources and are dependent on their carers. The dearth of accessible, attractive nature play space and play equipment along the northbound corridor, combined with outdated substandard play equipment in older parks, means that public health and social opportunities for community building are being neglected. And perhaps a response on that, Rachel Stephen-Smith, I'll go to you on that one. There is obviously a playground lobby, but it's for a good reason, and it connects with those questions about building community and having consultation and making family-friendly spaces.
Yeah, Genevieve, I think I've already said that my colleague Chris Steele will have more to say about playgrounds over the next little while, and we certainly have been doing that review and looking closely at what the playground needs are in the inner north, and there is indeed a lobby, as you describe it, Genevieve. I think one of the things, if I can just take this opportunity though to go back to the consultation question, I think it is interesting to look at consultation in planning versus consultation in a whole range of other areas where we've actually been really successful in implementing deliberative democracy processes and achieved really difficult reform, like the reform to motor accident insurance, where we set up a citizens jury, we worked through that, it was very transparent, people could come and watch the citizens jury, and we got a major reform that hadn't been achieved in any other way because people had confidence in that process. So I actually agree with Elizabeth that trust is a really major issue here. And I've seen planning officials trying really hard a bunch of different engagement processes, but unfortunately, and some of them work better than others, and some of them haven't worked as well as we would have liked. But when people come to the process with a lack of trust, and then there are a wide range of different views expressed, it is actually very hard. And Therese was right. We are not going to get consensus on many planning issues. But when you're looking at very underutilised pieces of land, you're not looking at green park sites like Block 25 in Section 72, you know, we do want to get on and do things for the betterment of the community. But that trust, I actually agree with Elizabeth, that trust is a really critical issue when we have those conversations.
And look, it seems to me in long years of covering these issues that trust is actually one of the fundamental things that goes wrong in these processes, and it has for many years. Bruce, I'm just going to go to you quickly on how legitimate it is for the community to have the final say, though. I've got some great suggestions coming through on the text about things like community halls. Someone saying a good proposal for Bill Pye CFZ would be the North Ainslie Community Hall. Craig's also messaged to say, voices we very rarely hear in planning, we're hearing represented here, young people needing space that doesn't involve spending money, older folk who have difficulties getting around. We need more of these voices consistently in the room. Should the community have the final say, Bruce? Is that doable?
Look, I think at a sort of the higher up or the higher level you go, I think it falls to the Assembly. You know, it's got to ultimately, they are elected as the decision makers, but at more micro level, certainly I think within certain, you know, parameters, the community, you know, can and should be able to take decisions. You know, they are the people on the ground, and it can come down to really minor things like, you know, putting in a box for library books in the park, which, you know, my local or the local park in my area has, you know, a particular tree. Is it shading the equipment or something like that?
Mm-hmm. I've got another message from David who says, an ageing male wonders why there's no public toilet at the new Dixon Transport interchange.
Can I just say one thing, that, you know, in terms of the consultation, I think another thing that really undermines the community trust is so many times it's the proponent of the project that actually runs the consultation, right? They're actually out there, they gather up the views, and then they sort of write a report, a summary of it, and that's what goes up the line. Well, what a surprise that there's not a lot of trust there, you know. I'd really like to see, you know, the public servants tasked with running the consultation, you know. The proponents obviously got a very legitimate view, you know, they're sometimes putting up money and that sort of thing, but they shouldn't be driving the process.
Okay. Look, I'm going to move on now to our third area, which is climate change and biodiversity. And just a reminder, there's lots and lots of messages coming through. If we haven't covered some of these subjects thus far, there will be a space at the end, 15 minutes or so at the end, which will enable you to have a crack at all kinds of other concerns. Shane Rattenbury, I'm going to go to you first. We spoke a few minutes ago about the Cairo site, and obviously there is considerable discussion about the environmental values there, the Aboriginal and indeed early colonial heritage that's being investigated now. Here in the inner north, where there's much denser development, I want to draw your attention to the urban heat island effect, which is something that is concerning, I think, a number of residents, and not, I would think, mitigated by the footprint of these apartment developments or indeed by bigger houses on increasingly valuable blocks. And we see the demographics of this community changing. The land is more valuable. People love being in the inner north and living the inner north lifestyle, and sometimes they build houses to match. Are you guaranteeing that climate change and urban forest strategies are being genuinely implemented here with that tension between the value of the land, the pace of development? Can you actually do that?
Well, they have to be, Genevieve. We cannot build a city that doesn't have that sort of green protection from the future climate that we're going to have in Canberra. It is going to be hotter and drier here, and we need to make sure that we're planting the trees now so that we get that 30% canopy cover that is in the climate strategy that I introduced in 2019. That means we need to put in place guarantees that this will be built. So the new climate strategy also calls for 30% of permeable surfaces across development sites, so there is space to plant those large trees. So those measures are now being implemented. I think we have seen, as you touched on earlier, some projects that have done a really good job of that and plenty that haven't. We need buildings with green walls. We need buildings that are better oriented to where the sun comes from, so they are warm in winter, they're not getting the hot westerly sun all the time. All of these things need to be built into the planning system.
Okay, Peter Swarbrick, I see you nodding there with that question about the urban heat islands and the capacity to deliver the urban forest strategies and the climate change mitigation effects. What are your thoughts?
Well, speaking as a real estate agent, I've been up close and personal with just the extraordinary nature of our newer suburbs. You know, like everything, people are complex, problems are complex. There's a whole bunch of things sort of, you know, contributing to this sort of idea of using up every piece of land. You know, the blocks are getting smaller, the houses are getting bigger. And I think it really is incumbent upon government to actually set a high standard for these things, because like everything, if we leave it to the market, if we leave it to builders, a lot of people don't use architects, they don't use landscape planners. They're not aware of the fact that planting trees can reduce their heat and their cooling bills by 15%. Trees have got a bad rap. People don't like them mucking up their pavements or their pools. So I think that it's a really important thing to be looked at, about who's buying these houses, what messages are they getting. So it's not just in the planning and the kind of things you're going to mandate as far as plot ratios, but it's really getting people to connect with the fact that this is going to impact not only on the comfort around their house, but their skyrocketing energy bills. So you need to bring, the building industry into this. You need to bring the design industry into this, architect industry into this, not just urban planners, because you can have this wonderful sort of, ideal of how this green city looks. But when I'm building my new house, I'm in charge of planting my trees on my own block. And so, this notion of a green city needs to come from a user basis, and it needs to be kind of embedded in the whole way in which all Canberrans look at their own ability to contribute as gardeners, as creating green sort of curtains around their houses, as well as being proponents and supporters of community gardens, green walls, green spaces that are going to be much more the government's remit to plan those public spaces. So it's a really, really wide conversation, and it has to have private and public people, on board with the same idea and all being able to coordinate their personal and public actions together.
Rachel Stephen-Smith, I'll give you a chance to respond on that and a couple of other questions that are also being raised by listeners. Chris says, for example, Founders Lane wanted to retain the adjacent street trees but were told that they had to be removed. I've got another message that says, for the many high-rise apartments that are west-facing, particularly along Northbourne, it's not clear how much of that heat can be mitigated through trees. The result, as a former resident of Lonsdale Street, is air conditioning units humming all day through the summer months. I certainly have a vivid memory some years ago of going to a friend's brand new flat here in Watson. Gorgeous, wonderful. And she said, yeah, it faces due west and you could fry an egg in here in summer. A full glass wall facing due west. What a fundamental, massive design error. If we go to livability and the value of green space, how much does it matter in the approval of the developments that we're seeing?
Oh, look, it absolutely matters, Genevieve, and that's why we've got a realistic urban forest strategy and a commitment to the 30% permeable space through a new territory plan variation, 30% permeable and deep rooting space in new developments. And that actually came out of the housing choices community consultation and the deliberative democracy process around housing choices. So it's clearly something that people broadly are very supportive of. I agree with you about design, and going back to a previous comment, I think it was Peter, about green roofs. When I came back from Washington, DC, in I think it was 2014, having studied that sort of urban design, I was stunned that that so many buildings were still being built without green roofs. Almost every new development that we were talking about in DC and the surrounding area had a green roof. It was just, when you did your capstone project, that you built it in to your project. And if people look at the renderings of the new CIT proposal in Woden, it has green roof, but we absolutely must create an incentive for that through the planning system. And that's something that, again, goes to the planning review. How do we build in the incentives for people to genuinely both orient their buildings appropriately, protect them and screen windows if they are west facing appropriately, but also build in the deep root planting and the green roofs? It's critical.
And Anthony says on the message stream, urban forestry should be at a scale that's equivalent to urban infrastructure. That is a pretty interesting idea to play with. Elizabeth, the Liberals have talked a lot about the 1 million trees. Now, there's been some criticism about what size and cost those trees would be and where they would actually be planted. Is your tree policy for somewhere out there, or is it for this increasingly fragmented green space here in the inner suburbs?
Look, the more trees, the better, Genevieve. So we'll be looking to make sure that we can put them wherever they are needed. There's no doubt that we all can play a part when it comes to the future sustainability of our city. And some of the things actually, you know, there's not much that we agree with the Greens on sometimes, but, you know, in some of the stuff that Shane said earlier about the planning stuff, it is about making those small changes that are smarter. And, you know, there's a lot of potential in our planning and in our transport space that we can do to ensure a more sustainable future. So it is about doing that. And like Rachel said, you know, it's a cultural change as well. It's about the expectation that we need to create within the community, as well as the decision makers and the legislators, that it is something to be taken into consideration. Because as we all know, retrofitting something is always going to be more expensive and much harder to do than if you had it planned properly in the first place. But to get to that future, we need to make sure that we take everyone on the journey with us, and that means making it sustainable, economically, socially, environmentally.
Can I just jump in and ask a question about incentivising? So, you know, one of the things about design is that if it's not going to benefit someone, if a good design isn't going to benefit a builder, and let's face it, when people build a house, that's where they spend their money. When developers build a block of apartments, that's where most of their money is sunk. So, you know, I've got a bit of a problem with the notion of letting the market, through incentives, sort of lead the design discussion. Really, I think, and Craig from ACCOS has talked about some minimum standards of universal design throughout our residential buildings. So I'd just like to raise that I think that this whole question, yes, we have to have individuals come on board, it's a cultural shift, but it's also about having minimum standards that are embedded in our industries that are supporting good design, building industries, energy efficiency products, that kind of thing. Mandated as minimum.
I'll throw that back to you, Elizabeth. Bruce, I'm going to go to you in a moment. A couple more comments. Nicholas says, what is a tree? There could be a wide range of interpretations. And Chris's message to say, in new developments, there's only room for a clothesline or a tree. You know, shame on that there can't be vegetable gardens as well. But Elizabeth, how do you respond to that question about incentivising this process?
So, sorry, I actually thought Peter was referring to Rachel, who talked about the incentive.
Yeah.
But,
I'll go to Rachel.
Right?
Well.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll go to Rachel as well. You got the floor. Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, yeah. No, look, there are already, of course, minimum standards, and we need to make sure that we are continuing to look at those to ensure that they are fit for purpose and that they are delivering what they are designed to do. And that is ensuring that those minimum standards, it's not the other way around. It's not like you sort of like, you know, embed something onto somebody and say, that's it, this is how you do it. But it is about taking people on the journey with you. Because if you want it to be a long-term plan and a long-term goal, it needs to be sustainable and people need to be taken on that journey together. It's not just about sort of mandating something out of the blue. So it is about, I think, a balance.
Rachel, how do you respond to that suggestion that incentivisation may not necessarily be the right way to go? Is there a way to bring people along on the journey? Is that the kind of approach that you're looking to guarantee, when it's hard to see how that would work in a community where there is so much energy and so much money and so much growth going into development that we're all recognising here on the panel, I think doesn't necessarily include green space unless people are sort of hauled into it?
Yeah, no, I think it's got to be a combination of both, and we absolutely do need to mandate minimum requirements of what we want to see. But I think we also need to work to create incentives in the system, whether that is around public expectation, whether you know, there are a range of ways you can do that through a planning system. But those minimum requirements, and not just around environmental performance and things like green roofs, but also around accessibility. And we've obviously been, you know, closely engaged in those national conversations about disability access and building design, and really wanting to mandate that at the national level. So those things, I think we need to continually move to improve our building standards and construction requirements through a mandated process, but I think we also as a community can create incentives to push the envelope even further.
Bruce, I will go to you on your take on the importance of more sustainable and connected green spaces and what it is that could guarantee their existence.
Well, actually, I wanted to make a comment on the incentives conversation. That language, to me, to be a bit blunt, that's just code for people not willing to stand up to the developers. You know, I think there is a place here. I think we need to move the dial a bit towards minimum, set standards. It's ridiculous to allow, large apartment buildings to be put up, whereas you put it, Genevieve, you can fry an egg in the afternoon. That is just ridiculous, just as easily, I think at that level, the Assembly should be there, mandating that, they will be a certain aspect, right? There's so much for consultation. In other places, the government goes on about minimum safety standards, all this sort of thing. Here, they're basically pussyfooting around the issue. I think for big developments, they've just got to be built correctly. I've been to some where the bottom floor of one of them gets no sun in the afternoon, in the winter time. That is just, committing someone, typically a poor, someone on lower incomes, to living in misery. And there's no need for it apart from that people weren't willing to stand up to a developer's greed. Basically they want to sell the blocks for the most amount of money and then go and then buy and then build things like, light rails at $100,000 a metre.
Therese, just quickly to you, what do you think from the Progressives' point of view is the most critical factor in the ACT's climate change policy for the neighbourhood? What needs to happen right here and right now to mitigate climate change in the inner suburbs?
Well, the Canberra Progressives, like many other parties, have got policies around a greening program. And just going back on the green space issue, government has to mandate where those green spaces are. It's not going to be up to developers to do that. So that's going to be part of smart urban planning in consultation with the community. Emissions reduction, we have a emissions reduction policy like other parties, but something that we have that's maybe different is really strong incentives to get people onto public transport by a heavily subsidised public transport program, which is a $50 a year My Way card, which gives you bus and tram transport for the full year. The other couple of things we have is waste management. We think the ACT could be a world leader in waste management. Why don't we just do it? Let's do the feasibility study and get something working there. And investment in new technology and new bioproducts such as bioplastics. We could actually have an industry like that in the ACT. So I haven't directly answered your question, but I use the opportunity to just get those policies out there.
I've got some interesting suggestions on the message stream about government education programs on design, and these things would seem to be very fundamental. Quite a few people saying, why would anyone buy a west-facing apartment? But they're there, they're built. I have no answer to why anyone would do that in our climate. And another text that says, the recent COVID shutdown saw large increases in people utilising green spaces and the local nature reserves in and around North Canberra, which exemplifies the value of the green spaces for the community, particularly in the summer months. Marianne says, Rachel, this goes to you. Delighted to hear Rachel using the word mandated. I'm a little confused though. That word seems open to interpretation when applied to heritage areas in North Canberra, perhaps straying slightly from the environment focus, but Rachel, would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have a further conversation with Marianne about that. As a fellow Reid resident, I know how important the heritage area in Reid is, and I know that Marianne is absolutely passionate about that, but I can't quite answer the question in the way that it's written. Obviously, there are very clear heritage requirements for some areas, but I also know communities have concerns about when those appear not to have been met, not just in Reid, but I also hear that from constituents in the inner south as well, particularly in the Kingston-Barton area. But yeah, happy to have that conversation, but can't quite, obviously some of those things are mandated and can't quite respond to the question as it's asked.
Okay, Andrew says the sun drives 100% of our climate. Our climate's always changed, not really a local government issue, not a local government issue under our constitution. Good on you if you're interested in conservation and low energy use and reducing pollution of all sorts, just not an anthropogenic climate change issue. Ian is pointing to the possibility of doing an Ainslie master plan that would link the suburb to the Ainslie-Majura Nature Park and Garden City design. The flow of wildlife through the area is incredible. People from right down Northbourne Corridor walk through this area. They love it. Let's embrace it. Shane, I can see the appeal in an Ainslie master plan, given the particular layout of the suburb. What do you think?
Yeah, and I really love this idea of having the wildlife flow right through the area. When we released our Repairing the Land package, this is one of the exact things we talked about, is making Canberra a wildlife sanctuary, so that the species can move through the city comfortably, that we are choosing trees that flower at different times of the year, so there's a constant source of food for wildlife. I think the master planning is particularly attractive, and having that certainty for residents. You know, we've got the Geocon example over at Kingston at the moment, where the residents believe that it's a 4-storey limit, and that's what's sort of set out in the planning rules, and they've come along and proposed an 8-storey hotel proposal. It's no wonder people get outraged. You know, if you think you've got a 4-storey limit and someone comes along and says, well, I'm going to build an 8-storey apartment building, that's where the trust gets undermined, and that's the problem. But certainly, you know, we want to see this idea of the wildlife moving through the city, Canberra being a city that integrates with the bush, even down to simple things like making sure we change our mowing patterns so that where those old seeds are coming up from the remnant trees, they're allowed to grow rather than being mown once every 6 weeks, and we actually get regeneration of those native seed stocks.
And the seed bank that's in the soil is quite spectacular. As anyone who's ever been involved in watching that happen, it's remarkable what's still in there. More comments saying, what about mandating solar orientation, double glazing, solar panels and efficient hot water systems for all the new developments? And another one, actually, I'll go back to you quickly, Shane, on this, saying, did the Greens approve the cutting down of 200 West Basin trees to improve wildlife flow? And we did have a question much earlier from George on that. And I'll just go back to that because I think it's now relevant to the conversation that we're having. Oh, now it's disappeared. We've had so many questions. But let me put that to you, Shane. West Basin and the cutting down of trees there.
Yeah, look, that is a tricky question. Overall, the Greens know we need to build a more compact city, and that does mean we need some urban infill in places, and that is always a contested question. Every new suburb we build around Canberra eats up the urban bushland, it eats up the potential agricultural land, and so we do need a more compact city, but we need to make sure that somewhere like West Basin, we are getting good tree planting, that we do protect as many trees as possible in those places, and that we also make sure that there's good public domain, and that is what's planned down there, and also that we have a mixture of social and affordable housing, that we don't end up with exclusive enclaves.
Can I just point out there's been no consultation at West Basin. Basically, the contract was let to fill in the thing before, but while the consultation was still open, as I understand it. And now the barricades have gone up in the last couple of days. What Shane's talking about, with the greatest of respect, is just completely divorced from what goes on the ground.
Rachel, I'll let you respond to that as a government minister. West Basin's obviously very contentious for a number of reasons. George is saying to me on the message stream, 200 trees, yes or no? Trees allowed to be cut down at West Basin without consultation?
Well, there has been quite a significant amount of consultation and input in relation to West Basin, but it's actually National Capital Authority that does the planning control for that West Basin area. So obviously it is a city renewal project. They would have put that forward. But it's also about the National Capital Authority, and they've had that vision for West Basin for a really long time.
Okay, look, I'm going to move on because I want to touch economic matters and social issues. We've had a couple of questions. Janine was asking earlier about mental health issues. I want to talk about the economic impact of the COVID shutdown and the ACT's GST revenue as well. We're in a difficult situation here in the inner north with the hit to the university sector, among other things. Progressives, to you first. Tim Boehm, on the social and economic issues around here, there's always been plenty of public housing in the inner north, plenty of legacy of disadvantaged people. We've touched on the common ground issue earlier on. Do you think there's a need for a targeted approach to poverty in the ACT?
I definitely do, but I want to throw this to Peter because she'll be biting at the bit to talk about this.
Okay, go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Tim. Look, absolutely. Poverty. Homelessness is it's I think I sat on an affordable housing forum, and we did get the leaders. I think Shane was there, Andrew Barr was, Yvette Berry was there, and Alistair Coe was there. And I think that they agreed to call housing a human right, that they all said that, yes, they would actually support that. As a call in the Legislative Assembly. It underpins so many things. So the lack of housing underpins recidivism in our prison population. It is absolutely crucial for women escaping violence. It is the, part of that poverty cycle. And when we had 1,600 people sleeping rough, and St Vincent's sort of assessing there is a need for 3,000 affordable housing or social housing places, you have to ask, why is 260 enough? Why is 60 a win? And why would we sort of, as the clever rich city that we are, pat ourselves on the back for having slightly less deplorable response to homelessness than the other states in Australia? So there's so many things we can do. ACTCOS has a fantastic platform. All of the people that work in this space are experts. They're on the ground. They know what the solutions are. It's will, and it's putting the funding into underpinning the housing, which is going to stop a whole bunch of social community issues. And let's face it, be a really great driver for a post-COVID economic recovery. And I'd just like to say, one of the most important things to support the women who are retiring into poverty in droves, a tsunami of women over 55. So this is just going to get worse. And obviously for us, it's a priority, very big on affordable housing. And look, we haven't been in government before. We're not going to form government. And we definitely would be taking advice from all those experts who do the work on the ground and know what needs to be done, and hope to be part of the will in our Legislative Assembly to put the money where it needs to be to solve this problem.
Multiple comments coming in on this. Anthony says, yes, I've been noticing more women living on the street. Nicholas says, housing is a human right. There is no contention. Rebecca, I know this is something that's right in your wheelhouse too. As a minority government partner, how would you stand up for the kinds of services that are often at risk, the pressures that are put on more vulnerable people when areas transform rapidly due to the kind of development we've been discussing?
Look, as you know, this is an issue that I've been working on for a long, long time. I was actually, as a very young person, the project officer that was leading the first poverty inquiry in the ACT. And, this is an issue that we've known about for a long time, and certainly wanted to really shout out to community organisations such as ACTCOS, Shelter, Anglicare, who have been doing some fantastic work in terms of bringing the data and actually the evidence in relation to the issues of poverty. Frankly, if people feel that poverty is a hidden issue in Canberra these days, they're not looking and they're not listening. That we actually absolutely know what the issues around poverty and disadvantage are, and we absolutely know that housing is fundamental and central to this. So certainly the ACT Greens see this as a key issue that we need to address and actually invest in significantly over this next term. So we have actually put a very clear strategy in place in terms of a significant investment of $450 million into investing into social and community housing. This is absolutely the time to be making this investment. There has never been a better time in terms of economic stimulus, in terms of time where it is actually appropriate that government is stimulating the economy. And this will go a long way to dealing with the issues of homelessness and housing unaffordability, which in this town is an absolute travesty. We have known since about 2009 the information started to come out about particular cohorts, such as older women, being at particular risk of homelessness. And we actually know what the answers are. We actually do need to invest in significant numbers of stock. We need to support specialist homelessness services, and so that, as part of what we've been talking about, is also providing an immediate funding boost to those specialist homelessness services that are being put under increased demand with reduced resources. And we also really need to look at You know, people that are operating in the, particularly tenants that are really struggling to operate in a private rental market that is increasingly unaffordable.
Genevieve,
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, could I just note, look, there's a whole lot of talk from Labor and the Greens about they've got the evidence, what they're going to do. But look, the facts are that particularly in recent years, the ACT, we're paying the highest rates and taxes per capita of any jurisdiction. So there's plenty of money in the system, and yet, and I'd also note that overall, they're not that big a proportion of people in Canberra who are in need, and I totally support providing for them. So there's an absolute discontinuity between the rates and taxes we're paying, and yet that there's some people who are still waiting on these services, and that's essentially why I'm proposing a wholesale review of how Labor and Greens are spending the money, because something just doesn't add up, as John Stanhope has noted time and time again.
Chris says on the stream, public housing per capita is decreasing. Where are the replacements for the hundreds of apartments demolished in the inner city? Candice, I just wanted to go to you. We're used to thinking of ourselves as a prosperous demographic, and population growth does mean that there are people who miss out as areas like this change their identity and they're built up. What's your solution for public housing and addressing disadvantage, given, of course, that many of us are so deeply connected to the idea of salt and pepper being fundamental to how we see ourselves as a community in the ACT?
So we do absolutely have a housing affordability crisis in Canberra, and we do have a growing poverty problem, and that was going on long before COVID. Our housing affordability crisis is it is a direct result of the policies of this Labor Greens government. As Peter mentioned, we've got 1,600 Canberrans sleeping rough every night. We've got 26,000 Canberrans living on or below the poverty line, including 8,000 children, and we've got 14% of Canberrans in rental stress. So that is really not good enough. This is why the Canberra Liberals are committed to lowering the cost of living. This is why we have committed to freezing residential rates, because that will also go a long way to lowering the cost of living and increasing housing affordability. We have also committed already to releasing more land for affordable housing across our city. And we have also announced our Poverty Commission, which will be headed up by former Labor Chief Minister John Stanhope. In terms of public housing and our broader housing policy, that will be released in the next couple of weeks, and we'll have a much more to say then. But those are some pretty major commitments so far that we believe will go a long way to addressing the housing affordability crisis and poverty in our city.
Rachel, a suggestion from Chris that says, can we scrap the tram to Woden, slower and less seats, and spend the money on what people want and need? I just want to throw this question to you on what your judgment is on the specific issues for this area around social disadvantage and the suite of issues that often come with that. I mean, obviously, as the area changes, there are costs and impacts. What are the risks for this area as things change, and how are you planning to address them?
I might just correct some facts in relation to some of the things that other people have said, Genevieve. There are absolutely not 1,600 Canberrans sleeping rough every night. There may be 1,600 people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, but that is a very different thing. And our fantastic community organisations and Housing ACT actually are very close to those people who are sleeping rough and stay very close contact. Fantastic services like Vinnie Street to Home actually stay in very close contact with those who are sleeping rough, who often have very complex issues to address. And the reason they're sleeping rough is not necessarily because there isn't a roof for them. It's because there are a range of other issues to address, which goes to the point that you have just made, Genevieve. Just in relation to Bruce's point, I'd just note that Canberrans actually in 2018-19 paid, and hasn't changed since then much. We didn't have a budget this year, obviously, paid the exact national average of local and state rates and charges.
No, that is not true. That is not true. And I will post, Rachel, I will post the fact.
Stop.
It's in the budget papers, Bruce, what every jurisdiction's charges. It's a combination of state and local taxes and charges, and we are exactly at the national average and below New South Wales and Victoria. I would agree with Rebecca and Peter in the sense of we know what the solutions are, and we have fantastic community organisations and advocates talking to us on a regular basis about what we need to do about poverty. But one of the key things that we need to do about poverty is not something that's in our control. Absolutely, the Commonwealth Government needs to raise the rate of job seeker / what used to be called New Start. And Andrew Barr was the first state or territory leader to come out strongly advocating to support the Raise the Rate campaign. We've seen as job seeker has increased through the COVID-19 pandemic, a really significant change in the people who have the lowest incomes in our community, their capacity to actually live from day to day and week to week. $40 is not enough to live on, and we need to raise the rate. And Genevieve, to go to your point, we also need to address those root causes of disadvantage. And in my portfolios, I have become so aware of the impact of trauma, childhood trauma, intergenerational trauma, and the need to have trauma-informed services, whether that's in drug and alcohol or mental health or homelessness and housing services, that actually can work with people where they are at. I've probably taken up too much time, but I think there are some really critical issues around how we actually work with the people who have the most complex challenges in our community to wrap those services around them. And that's what those housing first models that we've been investing in, like Axial and Common Ground, actually do. They give people a secure roof over their head and give them housing first, as the name suggests, while they wrap around other services around them to help them get their lives back on track.
And look, there are a number of questions coming in, people saying things like, what are you going to do to help the homeless gentleman living in front of Dixon Woolies? I've got another question from someone saying, my question is about homelessness in the inner north. This is the wealthiest city and one of the wealthiest country in the world. Why is anyone left homeless here? What is the commitment to adequate social housing so no one is homeless in the next term of government? And look, I would say, Rachel, I have just looked up the Institute of Health and Welfare figures on those who are rough sleeping, and absolutely, I think it is below 100, which is a different thing from homelessness. Homelessness is another big risk, and it manifests itself in a number of multiple ways. People who are couch surfing, homeless women, people sleeping in their cars, and so on and so forth. But I did actually just want to open that question about homelessness up to the rest of the panel, because I think we probably see it here in the inner north as much as anywhere else in the city as a whole. Shane, what's your response to that question, that the issue of homelessness is a complex and difficult one, but one that in some sense is in real tension with the development goals for areas like this part of the city?
Well, that's why we've put forward a very clear policy to invest in more social and community housing in Canberra. I was housing minister when we first built the first Common Ground here in Canberra. That's been enormously successful. The Greens have a very clear sense that we need to have a housing first policy, and that expression was used by someone else recently, but it's the idea that if you've got somewhere safe and secure to live, all of the other problems you might have in life, be it a mental health problem, a drug and alcohol problem, unemployment, and the range of other things, you've got a much better chance of sorting those things out. And so housing first is really the way to do this. That means that government needs to invest, because we have seen over recent years not enough investment in public and community housing, and the proportion has declined in the ACT. And it started in the late 90s when the Liberals sold off a whole ton of public housing in Canberra, and then since then there's not been enough investment. A few people have said, what about all the housing on Northbourne Avenue that got knocked over? I can assure people listening tonight that every single one of those apartments has been replaced. The same number has been rebuilt somewhere else. And I think that we do need to be careful of romanticising what some of those apartments are like. They were cold and damp and poorly designed, and they've all been replaced with 6-star rated modern properties where they're actually on smaller groupings as well, so you don't get those concentrations of disadvantage. And I think that's been real progress for people who live in that community housing.
Nicholas says, people don't need just somewhere to sleep, they need a home. Many people have a place to sleep but are still homeless because of their uncertain or unsafe circumstances. Peter, I see you nodding. This is obviously something that's significant for the Progressives.
Look, absolutely. And, you know, again, as a real estate agent, I was involved in selling developments that had built within them social housing. And one thing that really resonates with me that I've talked to various organisations about and read some stuff about is that it's the allocations might be there, but are they fit for purpose? Now, you're talking about who gets the west-facing apartments. Well, oftentimes that's booted over to the affordable apartment. It's the affordable apartment. It's got 2 bedrooms. It's got 1 bathroom and 1 car space. Now, that isn't actually a functional apartment for a family. So, you know, it's complex, but it's certainly the issues in Canberra are arising because it's about the type of housing that we're replacing with what we're taking away. It's about the sort of amenity of that housing. Is it fit for purpose for families? And I think that, you know, every frontline service will talk to me about housing. It is housing first. And yes, trauma-informed, dealing with all of the other things that are those attendant and oftentimes, you know, coexisting needs, very important. But the fact of the matter is that you've now got a very propertied private sector in Canberra. I meet people every day. They've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 investment properties. How is it that I'm living in a city where, you know, there are those people living in circumstances where they don't have access to not just emergency accommodation, but really good quality, affordable accommodation that does have a community, you know, that does have walkability to places and green spaces for their kids and places for their cars to park and their friends to come over. So, you know, it really is, it's got to be looked at holistically. And the thing that I keep hearing from all the people that I'm engaging with is that there's really, and look, I'm going to say this, there's a lack of respect in government about the strengths and the resources and the power that can be brought to bear by the frontline workers and agencies to actually solve this problem in some way, because, you know, the government knows they're right and they've got no reason not to actually hand over the money unless they just don't want to have a really wholesale approach to solving this problem and creating, you know, our own asset base, creating good infrastructure for the future of Canberra, and also absolutely, you know, funding the economy by having a social housing driven recovery. I just don't see why that is not a no-brainer.
Look, I'm just going to move on now to the next and final section, which is the general questions, because a number of the general questions I've got flow beautifully from this conversation. The first one is from Janine, who says, my question's about the broken mental health system. While it's great that money's being injected into the mental health system, we're not seeing tangible improvements. If anything, things are becoming worse. While the PACER project has been implemented, it does not appear to have been measured with any qualitative research. What's actually happening for the 83% of mental health clients who have not been admitted to the AMHU is their follow-up and stats on how these individuals are going after involvement with the PACER team. Now, I think these are direct questions to both Rachel and Shane, and I know it goes into both your portfolios. Rachel, I'll go to you first.
Actually, Genevieve, would you mind going to Shane first, as he is the Minister for Mental Health?
Yes.
Yeah, that's probably fair enough. So I've been responsible for implementing the PACER project. For those that don't know it, it's a tri-service model that actually sees a police, ambulance and a mental health clinician travel together to deal with people who are having a mental health crisis, and it brings each of their skills and their training into it. We have been taking quantitative measurements of what's happening with that project, and what we are finding is that around 83% of people, as Janine mentioned, are actually able to be supported at home rather than having to be transported to hospital, often against their will. I think this is a really good outcome for most people who are having a mental health crisis. They are much more comfortable in their own home than they would be being taken to the emergency department or being admitted to the adult mental health unit. There is follow-up for those people who do stay at home. A safety plan is worked out with them by the PACER team, and then they're followed up by the HEART team after that, who are intensive in-home support teams. So it's really important in the mental health space that we do try and develop new models. We simply don't want to be putting everybody into the adult mental health unit. It's not a great place to be if you can avoid being there. It really should be for the most acute cases.
Rachel, I'll just go to you because, of course, this goes in the wheelhouse of Labor policy for forming majority government. What's your comment on the status of the mental health system? Bearing in mind, of course, that there has always been this sort of fairly big chasm in the middle between early intervention and really acute critical care.
Yeah, and I think things like the HEART program that Shane touched on are critical supports there, and also the work that we've done to ensure that mental health assessment can be done right across the hospital. But I think, Genevieve, we've increased since 2009, increased mental health beds from 71 beds to 123 beds, and we're now building a new mental health ward at Canberra Hospital, a 10-bed ward, and we've had to put on 5 additional beds at Calvary Public Hospital during COVID because we've seen the increase in mental health admissions. So it is about addressing that missing middle. We've been particularly focused on young people and youth mental health. We've seen massive increases in anxiety and concerns about the impact of social media on anxiety and resilience. So a re-elected Labor government will do a piece of work with the community about that. But one of the most exciting things, and going to the question about evidence-based, one of the most exciting things I think in our recent youth mental health announcement was that we will implement Origin Digital's MOST platform, moderated online social therapy, for 5,000 young people who currently access Headspace and child and adolescent mental health services. And it really provides 24/7 access to a really evidence-based platform. We'll give them access to clinicians, to peer support, and to a range of materials that enable young people to build a toolbox to go to when they feel that their own mental health is deteriorating. And what has been seen through pilots of the MOST program is significant reductions in the number of face-to-face consultations that young people require, support while they're waiting for their first consultation, and then a significant reduction and an improvement in the speed of recovery as well. So that then will free up capacity in the rest of the mental health system. And then the other thing that I'm really pleased that we've put a really strong focus on is those young people who have comorbid mental health and drug and alcohol, or disability and or trauma, who tend to sort of be moved between different services because they don't quite fit. So a really clear multidisciplinary service to support those most complex young people.
I just want to very quickly, Elizabeth and Candice, to throw that over to you, because it's been for a long time, as I said a moment ago, the sense that there's this space in the middle, which is a difficult one to fill. And we see that particularly, for example, with things like eating disorders, and we still don't have an in-house patient treatment for eating disorders. There are many, many reasons for that. And, among them, the fact that in a low population, the number of people who will need to use those services at any given time is relatively low. Still deeply distressing, of course, for the people whose families are seeing their children or other family members in that situation. Respond on that issue of where the big gaps are in mental health services. We will move on in a moment to some other very local issues, but I think it's just important for us to hear from the Liberals on that.
One of the things that we have been concerned about is the lack of services, and especially the wraparound services that it's available for young people. And we know from all the evidence coming out of schools and the need for our school psychologists that our young people are starting to experience mental health challenges from a younger and younger age. For example, when you talk to people from Men's Link, they've started to go lower in terms of the age that they are starting to see people because, and mentor the young boys because of that issue. So we've seen that, and the Assembly actually, there was a committee inquiry of which I was actually a participant, I remember, which made an inquiry into youth mental health because of some of those issues. And what you identified, Genevieve, that in-house eating disorder clinic was actually one of the recommendations that came out of that. But also with that was a broad range of services that is needed. One of the things that came out very, very clearly was that very distinct drop-off in services that's available to young people that might drop off at 18. Now, we know that the brain continues to develop and a young person continues to, I suppose, if you like, for want of a better term, be a young person until well into their mid-20s. And we want to make sure that that missing part, that we don't have young people fall through the cracks in that regard. So that was something that really spoke very, very loudly to me during that inquiry.
And look, I do just want to acknowledge that Janine who asked this question and cares very much about this, has lost her own daughter. And so I just really acknowledge, Janine, your sadness and the great tragedy that represents for you and for your family. We've got just over 10 minutes left. So I do just want to move on to a couple of other questions, one of which is about the Dixon shops. And I think we weighed in here on an issue with which we're all very, very familiar. And I do just pause, Bruce, to note that we're trying to unmute you. Bruce can't unmute himself. I'm trying to unmute him. We're trying to work that one out, but we're on it, Bruce. We know that you can't speak, and we'll try to fix that.
No, it's just been fixed. Thank you, Genevieve.
Okay, you're on. Good.
Thank
Not
you.
deliberately excluded, Bruce, just technological glitch. And this question is, compared to even Tuggeranong, I'm shocked by how dilapidated the Dixon Shopping Centre has become. The infrastructure has not aged well. The new development adjacent to Northbourne Avenue simply won't hide the decay of Dixon. Fix Dixon is the plea. Rachel, I'll go to you first on that. There's no doubt that there's some real truth in that. The Dixon shops look tired.
Yeah, and look, the City Renewal Authorities are very aware of that and has been working with Dixon traders, and big shout out to Jay Mann, who's been doing some of that work to really plan for renewal around Dixon. And of course, there's been a fair bit of work in relation to Woolly Street, but we do need to move that work into the area around the library and around the main shopping centre there. I don't think anyone would disagree that does need some TLC.
Yeah, Therese, what about you?
Yeah, look, I agree the Dixon shops are awfully run down and dilapidated. Again, the Progressives, we believe in making progress with principles. So any development and planning around Dixon needs to be done in consultation with the community and with a view to the aesthetics and beauty and sustainability of the place as well.
Rebecca, Dixon is one of those, for me, an absolute archetypal Canberra space, because you see everyone in Dixon. It's that terrific thing about living in the inner north, is that we're all in here together. But there's no doubt that things look tired. We've had other comments that things are run down, that socially the space is difficult to navigate for many reasons. Do we need some action there?
Yeah, look, Dixon is my local shopping centre, so I spend a lot of time in Dixon, and it absolutely looks tired and needs some love. It is still a place that, there's certainly character in this space, and some place that I really need, I really love to go to. Absolutely, there's action, and I know that there's been lots of contention around the proposed development. A lot of work's been done. Certainly, my understanding of the latest design was actually a design that people were, while there are still concerns held about some elements of it, it was much more supportive within the community, and the issue around COVID has sort of slowed down that part of the space, which I think is impacting on a lot of other parts of Dixon. But absolutely, there is a need to be action. There needs to be action. But there is. I also know that there is people like Jay and others that are really working hard. The bulbs from Floriade, I think, are starting to bloom. So I think people are working hard. But it is something that we absolutely need to be putting some more attention to.
Yeah, I think big thumbs up from everybody about flowers being right through the city. I think this is just a wonderful initiative. Anthony says Dixon always has the largest number of people visiting the Vinnie's van when it calls there. Bruce, now that we can hear you again, Dixon shops. Dixon shops, what are your thoughts, Bruce?
Well, I go back a long time at Dixon shops, so look, it is great that there's diversity, so I really like that. Look, there should be a reasonable level of amenity for everyone there, It's not good where things decay too far. And look, I come back to the point, there's plenty of money in the system, broadly defined, to bring that on.
Okay, look, on another development question, I might go, Candice and Elizabeth, to you. This question's about Civic, and it says it's time to fix Civic. The heart is now a shopping mall. The city is bisected by 6 lanes of traffic and a dead median strip. Our most valuable heritage buildings, Sydney and Melbourne, are decaying. City Hill is an island, inaccessible to people. Let's investigate putting Northbourne Avenue underground in a tunnel from south of Barry Drive, under City Hill to south of London Circuit, and removing Vernon Circle. This is a big thinking question with 6 minutes left to go. This would lead to the creation of a town square in this traffic-free area of Northbourne and activate private investment and the renovation and redevelopment of the Sydney and Melbourne buildings. It's an investment for the future. What do you think?
Look, it's a very big idea. I think we're obviously all in furious agreement that Dixon is old and tired and does need a lot of love. And the same definitely does go for the city centre. That is also one of the reasons why we, the Canberra Liberals, did oppose and are opposing the West Basin development and the plan for apartments there, because we think that we do need to consolidate our existing precincts and to make sure that our existing precincts, like the city and like Braddon and that, are lively and activated, you know, and the best places that they can be before we do move on to new precincts. I think all of this does also go to a much broader issue around Kurrajong, and that is the fact that residents in Kurrajong are paying some of the highest rates in Canberra and have had their rates increased by the largest amount. So residents in most suburbs have had their rates, on average in Kurrajong suburbs, rates have increased by 70, 80, 90% since Andrew Barr became Treasurer, and yet local services are getting worse and worse. So it's those infrastructure upgrades that haven't been provided, footpaths, street lighting, playgrounds like we've mentioned before, public toilets I think was also mentioned in the chat before, and our local shops not being looked after. And that's what the Canberra Liberals are all about this election. It's about lowering the cost of living, lowering rates and taxes, and providing better services.
I do have another text that says it would be great if the revitalisation of Dixon included new organic community spaces, because the prohibitively high land prices in places like Braddon and in those central areas of the city has stifled potential for interesting artistic spots. Artists can't afford to establish spaces in those areas. We need more imagination if we want to make Dixon vibrant rather than simply redeveloping. Just very quick last comment to you, I think, Rachel Stephen-Smith. I've just got a comment from someone who says city renewal has no budget, that this is all very well, but there is not enough budget to make interesting ideas happen.
Someone who I know well, but who doesn't go to forums in the inner south, because I can assure him that that is not the view of people in the south who see the city renewals budget as being very significant. And I know that we have constant discussions about it, but yes, it does have a real budget.
Okay, and Gordon says the buildings in the Dixon shops are owned by private landlords. The government should be demanding that they put some money into the space around their buildings. Look, I think we have canvassed an enormous amount of territory this evening, and there have been dozens and dozens of messages coming in from the many people who are watching and listening. And to me, this is one of the terrific things about the role that community councils play in Canberra. They're truly voices of many, many ordinary people. And I think there can be real criticism of community councils. People say, well, look, you know, where's the legislative authority or power, or so on and so forth. But the key here is conversation and all of us meeting together as a community. So I think we've had actually a very positive, very cheerful, very friendly conversation tonight with, as always in Canberra, quite a surprising amount of agreement actually. The odd disagreement, but quite a number of people agreeing with each other, and that's because this is our community and it's a place that we all love very much indeed. So I want to thank all our would-be politicians. Bruce Paine, thank you very much. Sorry about the mild glitch with the mute, but I'm glad we worked that one out.
That's okay, thank you.
Rebecca Vassarotti, great to have you here, thank you. And Elizabeth Lee, Candice Birch, thank you so much for being part of our conversation. Tim Bohm, thank you. Your great passion for politics is acknowledged. Shane Rattenby, terrific to have you with us. Therese Faulkner, thank you so much indeed for your time. Rachel Stephen-Smith, another dedicated local, thanks for being here. And Peter Swarbrick, many, many thanks. Lots of thanks coming in on the line too from everybody else. Thank you all candidates, organisers and participants. And let's see what the election is. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.